Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of The Joy of Game Mastering, in which I will be telling you all about pre-written modules and so how to use an adventure module that's already been published, how to dive into material that somebody else has provided, and find a use for it in your own games. Finding ways to tweak it, finding ways to adapt it, harvesting it for parts, whatever we want to do. So it's a very interesting topic. I'm going to give everybody a couple of minutes to start filtering in as we get closer to start time before we really dive into the subject. So hello, Gray Matters Gaming, Gray Matters Game Mastering. How are you doing today? Hope you're having a wonderful Tuesday. Hello, Gerald. All right, as it is 5 o'clock now, or whatever time it is yours time, I will go ahead and reveal myself. So, hello, everyone, and welcome to this installment of The Joy of Game Mastering. My name is Alex. I'm going to be your joyful game master today, helping break down some of the mystique around a number of different Game Master topics. So, lots of things to talk about. Today, we are talking about adventure modules and So, last week we had this topic requested, so we are going to dive into pre-written adventure modules, how to use them for your group, how to harvest them for parts, how to make them really work for you the way that you want them to. So, we're going to grab into that. And I am going to be using the first adventure from Chrono Crisis as an example of how to do this. I will try to avoid spoilers for people who are, in Squire's case, planning to run Chrono Crisis, and some of their family players may be around. Gray Matter, I definitely get that, of the tired of not having any motivation. It has been a long couple of days here at Castle Thomas. So I'm going to give people a few more minutes just to pile in, and then we'll get into the topic proper. And Squire, if you're here, where do I find your questions? I see that you said, ask my questions for me. If those questions are listed somewhere, I'd be happy to answer them. Really glad to get 2 of these in a row. It's been hard finding some consistency for my schedule for Joy of Game Mastering, but it's important that we get together and talk about this topic because it's very near and dear to my heart, and it's one of the most important things you can do as a gamer is delving into that divide of the Game Master. And if you have any questions about how to adapt a module for yourself, please go ahead and let me know. So yeah, pre-written modules. They are a wonderful resource for game masters for a number of different reasons. Basically, game masters will take the time, publishing companies will take the time to put together a package of adventure notes that you're able to take your own and put your own spin on it. It's a way to get into a little bit of the nitty-gritty of becoming a game master without having to dive fully into the story development or the rules management, sort of having that little bit of a buffer between you and running an effective game. You can often count on an adventure module being fairly well balanced, developed by people who have a good sense of the game that you're going to be running. So you know that it is generally going to be pretty good to play. It's important whenever you pick up an adventure module, for whatever reason. I prefer to read through them all the way through first myself, taking notes about specific things. I dive into specifically the backstory, the motivation of the villains, trying to figure out what is interesting about this module and what I can use for it. I'm going to be using the term adventure module to describe this thing. This would be things like Our Astonishing Adventures for Mutants and Masterminds, adventure modules that you can pick up on community content sites like the DM's Guild, lots of things for all sorts of RPGs. They call them all sorts of things. But adventure module is my sort of known vernacular for these things. And the first thing I think when I look to pick up a published module is I ask myself, why do I need this adventure? What am I trying to do with this adventure? And there's a couple of questions I like to ask myself. What is the purpose? Am I picking up this adventure to run as a palate cleanser from my regular sessions? I did this with our adventure into the Idiot Box because we had some pretty heavy stuff happen in our Nether War campaign, and I wanted to sort of add a little bit of lightness and levity after a bunch of stuff happened. So it was a very different change from what I was writing and what I was running in Nether War, and it made for a very good breakup in that sort of bad news trend. So that can be a palate cleanser for your regular sessions. And that can go either direction. If your games are usually sort of zany and wacky and you pull up a very serious adventure, that could just be something to add a little bit of variety to what your players expect when they show up to your game. You might get a pre-written adventure as a break for your brain to catch up with the stuff you're writing. So say you're stuck, you've written yourself sort of into a corner, and you need a few more weeks to get your ideas out and get them in a way that is satisfactory to you. You can pick up a pre-written module and slot that into that spot. And you might even be able to find inspiration in that module to help you out with the spot that you've written yourself into. Or just to give yourself a bit of a break to avoid GM burnout if you're running into situations where you're constantly homebrewing things, you're constantly writing down all of this new information. Maybe it helps to give yourself a little bit of a mental break and have somebody else do that for you. Some other reasons to pick up a module could be a demo of a game system your group isn't sure they want to do a full campaign for right away. Things like starter boxes for a number of RPGs. Any introductory adventure is going to have a lot of fun opportunities for you to sample a game before committing to writing, running, and playing in a full-fledged campaign. So that's a great way to just get a sprinkle. And it could be you're rotating the GM out and your regular GM has asked you to step in and run a game for a session or two. And the pre-written module is a great way to have an adventure and just dive into that. Another interesting idea specifically for Chrono Crisis is you can look at it as a flashback to deliver information to the players in a gamified way. This first adventure we're going to be talking about today, it does take place during World War II. And the central conceit of the adventure is that you time travel back to that point in time, but there's no reason you have to. If you want to modify that adventure a little bit, you could say that this is the players being told a story of something that happened during the war, and they take on the role of some of the primary NPCs in that story. So you can sort of swap them in and out as you're going. Gerald says, I don't usually run modules, but I ran the first part of the Lost Library for some friends and it went really well. I'm glad. Gerald, how did your Cape City Chronicles finale go last night? I saw that, or last night or the night before, I saw a Twitch notification that you were in your finale. Yeah, let's not just talk about Independence Day, though. Let me show you a little bit of it. Oh. Window, not a Chrome tab. Good wrap up for all the characters. I love to hear that. That's awesome. All right, I got to pull you guys over to my other monitor. And I'll pop this up on stage with me. So, yeah, just diving into Mutants and Masterminds Independence Day, a time-hopping adventure for 4 to 6 heroes at power level 10. So looking into a fun general story. You might be interested in the idea of doing a Golden Age superhero story, so you want to slot that into your regularly scheduled programming. Could be, like I said, a flashback to deliver some important information without having to give a long speech. Lots of different things. In this instance, I'm going to assume that my players are heading back in time and beginning the steps onto the Chrono Crisis adventure path. So part 1, part 2, part 3. And what I would start to do is I'd read through the introduction here and the secret origins to see if I like this adventure. Generally, you could tell from the text on the sales page for DriveThruRPG or over at the Green Onion store if you're going to like this kind of adventure, or even by the cover. I mean, if you see a gorilla on a submarine shooting at a bunch of superheroes, you pretty much know if that adventure is for you when you sign up. So just looking at it, go through the secret origins to see, okay, do I like this? Do I want to do the whole adventure? Are there things that I want to get into? And you want to start thinking, what is this adventure for? Like I said, I'm going to assume that this adventure is the beginning of the Chrono Crisis adventure path, and my party of superheroes is going to be caught up in all that. So I'm going to run it pretty straightforward as it is out of the box. However, there's a few things that I go into next as we're looking at how to do an adventure module for yourself. The first thing I do after I read through the adventure, I take my notes, I look at places where my characters can have this story tailored to them. So, adventure modules, by their very nature, tend to be written generally. So you're looking for, this should be able to slot into any campaign, but as the game master for your group, you have an advantage that we, the designers, don't have, where you can go through and say, I want to make sure that this is exciting for my characters, so I'll do X, Y, and Z. Gerald says, I'm starting to get some Quantum Leap ideas, jumping into the heroes of the day and taking care of the crisis. Yes, Quantum Leap is a wonderful idea, especially for like a flashback sort of sequence. And that could even be not necessarily a flashback, because their consciousness is in the hero, so they might not know who's going to survive that story. That's a way to avoid some, well, you're here, so you probably survived the story, sort of dramatic irony. For this adventure, I'm going to assume that I've got a party of 4 characters, and I'm going to be looking at, specifically, Centuria, Bowman, Johnny Rocket, and Daedalus. Superheroes from the Freedom League, who are well known in the setting. So we're going to be assuming that those are our player characters. I'm going to assume that they're power level 12 instead of power level 10. So I've already presented myself with a number of challenges. This adventure is for, like I said, suggested power level 10. So our heroes are a little more powerful than that. So we're going to want to look at some ways to increase the difficulty of the game that we're going to be running. That is one way to modify an adventure to make it useful for you. The other way, that's all number stuff. I'll go over that in a little bit. The real thing I want to get into the meat of is, how can I make this more poignant for my specific characters? So there's a couple of different interesting ways that we could do this with this adventure specifically, because Bowman, Centuria, and Johnny Rocket all have family members who are active superheroes in this time period. So there's something there. We can, in this adventure, Golden Age Bowman shows up in the text. So we know that there's a precedent for NPC heroes who may have a relationship with the future heroes who are here in the past. How is that interesting? How can we tweak that and make sure that that's something for them to hook onto emotionally? Look at any conflicts they might have with those family members. In Centuria's instance, her father is dead in her timeline. So seeing him here in his prime, that can open up a lot of different emotional avenues for that player character, which is something really awesome to dive into. Bowman, his grandpa is the Bowman of this story, and I believe his dad is the sidekick, Archer, in this story. So there is something, that's the whole family tree all teaming up together, and that's a really cool way to invest your characters in what's going on, particularly in this kind of time travel adventure. And the cool thing about Daedalus is he was actually alive and in this world, in this city during this time period. So there's an instance, does Daedalus run into Daedalus from this time period? Does he replace Daedalus in this time period? Does he have future knowledge about what happened here that can influence how the game is going? These are the questions you want to be asking as you're trying to connect the game to your characters. That's the first step for me whenever I dive into a pre-written adventure is, how can I take this sort of general scenario and zero it in on my players? This doesn't have to just be friends or allies or anything like that. This can be a nemesis. So you might look and see, do any of my player characters have a particular disdain for another member of Shadow? Maybe Zeitgeist can be swapped out for any of the big Shadow guys who are present here during the war. Superior is a very popular antagonist for Centuria. You might even do Overshadow himself, since we're looking at power level 12 characters. Are we going to be going to a much higher power level just to add that extra little bit of danger to move us from 10 to a challenging encounter for a power level 12 group? And maybe it doesn't even have to be Shadow. Maybe Daedalus has beef with the Labyrinth, and maybe Taurus is involved in whatever's going on here in Freedom City during this particular 4th of July celebration. We're looking at all sorts of things. Rebel Moose says, if you're giving the adventure a Quantum Leap flavor, you need one player to say, oh boy, it's the law. That's true. And that's the other thing is, your players' touchstones. So if they have an interest in a Quantum Leap style adventure, you can look for something similar to that when you're digging through to figure out what published adventure you want to run. And a lot of adventure modules will go through and they'll include information for, little sidebars to help you tailor it to your group. So here at M&M, we like to do a problem powers sidebar, which details how to, are there superpowers that are going to make this adventure easier? So in this instance, heroes with fast movement powers, like Johnny Rocket, might be able to bypass all of the sneaking around in the beginning of Scene 3, but that's not too significant of an issue. Feel free to emphasize the hordes of Shadow Troopers, include some heavy weaponry to encourage the heroes to use stealth, but if they don't and just go right to the bay, move right onto them, finding the U-boat and confronting Zeitgeist. So if they do just want to rush through what's to the end of the adventure, they can do that, and then you have the opportunity to just unload a bunch of consequences for their actions. And then there are, superpower games. There are things like super speed, like mind reading, like insubstantial, all that fun stuff that you want to keep an eye out when you're designing your story. So the main antagonist of this story, Gabrielle, has kept her true motivations to herself. So dealing with Zeitgeist won't immediately reveal who the main antagonist is because he doesn't know. But he can give them a little bit of a head start because he's seen her before. He doesn't really know what her deal is or what she wants, but they can figure out what her name is and what she looks like, but that doesn't really bring them closer to stopping her. But it can be a nice way to reward players who chose those abilities for their characters. One of the important things when dealing with an adventure module is not thinking necessarily about how these powers are going to, how can I stop them from using these powers? You want to be able to say yes and provide a reward for people who choose those abilities for their character without necessarily breaking the game, but looking through and seeing where are my opportunities to say, hey, that's cool that you picked that power. That's cool that you have that connection. Here's a spotlight, talk about that for a minute. So we decided we're going to do Chrono Crisis. We're jumping into the past. We've got a couple of the Freedom League's heavy hitters here at power level 12 doing all the fun stuff. And then we figure out how the heroes get into the adventure. Typically, with a published adventure, there's something like an adventure hook or the opening scene is intended to involve the heroes, how to bring them into what's going on. Often, we'll provide a list of examples as to why the heroes might be in on this. For Chrono Crisis, a mysterious stranger pulls the heroes out of the present and drops them right in the middle of an invasion in Freedom City. So if you want to run it that way, you don't need a real big reason that they've been pulled into this scenario. It's just a side effect of Gabrielle's awesome power, or a unknown symptom of what Gabrielle is up to, an unintended consequence of her power. But there are other things that you can do. If you don't like that idea, you can figure out other ways to involve the heroes. You can say, okay, so maybe they've been summoned to a museum to have a discussion with a historian who's like, something is wrong in the past. I know that this is not the way that history played out. What can we do? Or you can even go to the next level and say that history has changed, therefore the present has changed, and just throw the heroes into the deep end of, a shadow invasion of Freedom City during the war resulted in a shadow victory over the Allies, and now they are living in Shadow City instead of Freedom City. And they're the only ones who know that something is wrong, so they have to find a way to go back in time and undo this. So lots of cool and interesting ways to dive into that concept. And then we tend to have a big explosive opening scene. It's a very popular way to get people invested in what's going on without necessarily giving a lot of lead in. And this is something that you want to ask yourself when you're running this adventure. Is this an example where a bombastic opening is right for my group? If it's a demo or a one-shot, I would recommend it because it is instantly we're in. This first scene is giving us an opportunity to sample some of the rules, to get just sort of break the ice and get comfortable with each other, and then we're off to the races. In this adventure, there's an attack. There's at a parade, and they shift from the modern day to the Golden Age, and they get attacked by a horde of shadow troopers. This is an instance where the higher PL level that we're dealing with is going to be important. Typically, in a pre-written module, if they're written well, there's going to be a variable amount of enemies in a scene, depending on things like amounts of characters, power level for characters, and you'll want to dive in there. Dealing with the power level 12 group, we want to think, do we throw more of these power level 5 shadow troopers at them, or do we increase the power level of the shadow troopers and come up with a reason for it? I think there is an opportunity to do so if we want. If we want to move the shadow troopers to like power level 7, we can say that they have gone through the time loop so many times that these are hardened veterans of this exact battle. They have fought this battle 6,000 times, and they know what's going to happen. They have this little bit of foresight. So that foresight can be a higher power level, making them tougher, or it can be weird tricks. Things like luck control, or you took out that group of minions, but another group of minions that is identical to that one pops up over here because they knew that was going to happen. Things like that. So you have the chance to sort of figure out what the higher difficulty looks like. And like any combat encounter, you want to ask yourself, what's the point of this encounter? Is it to showcase how cool the heroes are? Is it to give us a grand challenge against the main antagonist of the adventure? Or is it just sort of no fight should be just a run-of-the-mill combat encounter, in my opinion. I believe that every scene in an adventure should serve to push it forward in some way. And again, please feel free if you guys have questions. Let me know down in the comments over here. I'm checking in over here. Yeah, this is our opening scene. I like it as it is for our exact situation because we have an opportunity here now to introduce the heroes to their family members. So in the adventure as written, we get relief from Bowman and Arrow as they come flying in. But there's no reason that we can't have Bowman, Arrow, and Johnny Rocket come in, or Bowman, Arrow, Centurion, Johnny Rocket, and Daedalus come in and have sort of a what moment with the heroes as they realize, wait, I'm you, or that's my kid, or just that sort of like uncanny moment between everybody, where that really becomes the point of this scene. If you add all those extra superheroes, this is no longer a consequential fight scene. The real meat of this scene is, oh, these are all people that we know and care about, and Daedalus. So yeah, just diving into that concept and retooling what this scene is for. It's an opportunity for them to team up with people that they never had the chance to team up with, and to have sort of a touching role-playing scene in the midst of this now inconsequential combat scene, because there's a whole bunch of power level 12 superheroes here. That's a lot of pointing memes. Yeah, it's all Spider-Man. It's Spider-Man the whole way down. Yeah, and then again, at the end of each scene, typically you're going to get something that's like a wrap-up or a transition, or like, what information are we getting from here? With the wrap-up, we say what happens next, or what what is the natural progression of the story from this scene into the next scene. And this is your opportunity for your next chance to modify an adventure for yourself. As written, each scene is sort of intended to be, played through in a couple of sessions, maybe a week, or maybe 5 or 6 sessions if you really stretch it out. Or you can blow the scenes out and you can add additional scenes in the midst. The goal of an adventure module is to be a toolbox for you as the game master to tell a story that is, suited to your play style and suited to your needs. If you only like one scene in the adventure, you can take that scene out of the adventure, strip it of whatever connecting tissue in the adventure it has, and then slot it into any other adventure. Or if you are not sure how to stat up something like a hazard challenge or something like that, you can look at a pre-written adventure module, find something similar, and then just tweak it so that it's useful for you. The goal is to make this a toolbox for you. And feel free to move anything around. I ran Nether War, which is 6 adventure modules. I turned it into 53 sessions. So I'm the problem, it's me. Yeah, and then again, as you're going through the module, you should have read through it the first time just to see sort of what all is going on, and looking at what kind of scenes we've got, what's the variety. And you can tailor these scenes again to your group. Is your group interested in big role-playing scenes, or is this an opportunity where you can change it into a combat because that's what they're really looking for? Or is it something you could streamline and just make a conversation and not a whole scene? Or are there other ways that you can deliver this information to the groups that is more fitting for them? These little chunks of information are what you want the heroes to know before they move on to the next scene, or to give them clues into moving from scene to scene. And there's information that you can turn into background, like notes or journal scraps that they find instead of a conversation. You can combine a bunch of them into one sort of quick cutscene where your players maybe don't want to get into a big conversation, and you just say, Bowman tells you blah 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 blah, if that's what your group is into. Or you could take these little bits of dialogue and then blow them up into a monologue if that's something that you're a fan of. Whatever works for you. And again, make sure as you're going through, if you're changing any of this information, like, what about the other heroes? In this instance, what other heroes? You're the first other costume crime fighters I've seen apart from me and Arrow. So in our example, we have put the other Freedom League members back into the circulation. So, what does Centurion, Johnny Rocket, Bowman, and Daedalus have to say about this? Or if Daedalus isn't here, is Daedalus freaking out because he's like, did I stop existing at some point and I'm still here? There's a lot of fun and interesting ways to tweak that and to play with those ideas to make it more what you need. And the idea typically of expanding a scene into additional scenes, maybe even to a whole adventure, is to look at its composite parts. A lot of pre-written modules will have sort of these clear headers that delineate, where these are taking place. So taking counsel is the discussion between Bowman and the heroes, just saying what's going on here in Freedom City. And then the second part of that is the plan of attack. So maybe they had that conversation, and then Bowman, instead of just continuing the conversation, turns it into a whole challenge sequence to gather information, or they go out to do a stakeout. Where can you add length if you need to, or you want to add length? Where can you shorten things if you want to or need to shorten things? Are there scenes you could take out and find other ways to sprinkle whatever information or whatever connecting tissue you need elsewhere? It's very much a matter of taste, a matter of style, and a matter of what you're comfortable with and how much work you want to put into it. Pre-written module gives you that inspiration, gives you the first jump into the story, but that doesn't have to be the whole story. You can put just as much work into a pre-written module as you do for a module you write yourself, if that's where the spirit moves you. Like I said, I turned Netherwar into a year-long series of adventures, so it can be whatever you need it to be. And like I said, there are instances, the scene 3 here, a conflict challenge, is a perfect example of a place where we can move and add additional content in if you need this to be longer. Because we're looking at, they're navigating the subway, trying to find some information. If they're navigating the subway, each of these is a particular challenge that they might run into. Beasts, monsters, a collapse in the tunnel, intruders coming up from Subterra. An intruder coming up from Subterra, that can become a whole separate adventure where they're navigating the tunnels, they collapse, and they wind up in Subterra, and they have to find their way out of this little pocket of the Hollow Earth to get back to the adventure that they were previously on. You want to be careful with too many non sequitur changes like that, but if your players are into that stuff, dive in. If you want the collapse of this tunnel to be a whole adventure, dealing with protecting the people who are down here, particularly the resistance members who are fighting back against Shadow, trying to restabilize the structure as it's coming down, looking for different areas to, are there Shadow agents in different spots so that there's actually combat interspersed with this challenge to avoid the collapse? Or are you happy with, these are little bitty scenes that I can include in the scene. I can pick and choose what I want from this. So if I want monsters to show up, the weird temporalness of Gaviel and Zeitgeist leads to other time-displaced things showing up in Freedom City. Maybe a dinosaur, maybe a giant monster, maybe a kaiju, whatever you have. And that's also a clue that there's more going on. So asking yourself that. Rebel Moose says, if we're writing a module ourselves, is there a template you'd recommend to help us know what/how much info to include? There is. I actually shared my template on the Atomic Think Tank over in the members area, just breaking down how I sort of detail my plan for an adventure. Looking at, there's sort of composite parts that you need to make sure you have. You want to know, and I'll go through it here in this adventure. You want to know something, we call it the secret origins. This is the backstory, sort of the antagonist, what has led the antagonist to this point in the story to cause this trouble. In a superhero story, superheroes tend to be reactive instead of proactive, so my secret origins often deal with the antagonist's actions leading up to the point that the heroes enter the story. Sort of what their goal is, what would happen if the heroes don't get involved, and why they're doing this. the next part I tend to include, we call it in this exciting issue. Some people call it in this adventure. Some people call it an adventure synopsis. It's basically a paragraph or two per scene that breaks down what each scene is about, leading from the beginning where the heroes enter the story to the point the heroes exit the story, and what kind of challenges they might meet along the way. This gives you the chance to really zero in on what you want the story to include, and gives you the chance to figure out how many scenes does this need to be, and what information do I need to do as I take this in this exciting issue and blow it out into a full story. And then the last thing in the intro, before we get into the scenes, I'll include an involving the hero section. This might be called an adventure hook section. This is, how do the heroes get involved? Do they have a benefactor who brings them in? Is there a bizarre circumstance that throws them into the depths of the story? Are there, is there a reward? Is there, why are the heroes here? And then I do the scenes. I break down how many scenes I think I need. I'm trying to make sure that they're varied. So I look at, my scene 1 is a combat scene. What do I do in my next scene that's not a direct combat scene right after that? Because variety is what makes the adventure's pace a little bit better and makes it more interesting to get engaged with. And I base that on my in this exciting issue. If I have these plot points that need to happen, where are the scene breaks there? And then I go through and I break down the scenes. Each scene, if there's any flavor text that I want to have written down, I'll write that down. But really, I just need to know when I'm detailing a scene for myself, where are we, what's happening, and do I need to know any rules? For a combat scene, that tends to be an introduction to the scene, and then here's the attack. And then we have a tactics section. Some people call it role-playing this monster. Whatever that section is, you tell the GM who is taking your module, or you tell yourself, this is what these villains are going to do in this fight, and this is what their goal is, and what they want to pay for that goal, and what they're willing to sacrifice for that goal. In this instance, the Shadow Squadron that is coming through, their goal is to corral civilians and sow terror. So their main goal is disabling vehicles to block roadways, stall parade floats and cars, and to sort of scare civilians into going in a certain direction. And they're willing, in this instance, they know that they're stuck in a time loop of some description, so they're not necessarily bothered by casualties. But the heroes being here is a novelty, so the villains do have a goal of, we need to get back and tell the boss that there's something new in the loop. And that's what they want. You include any relevant stats that you need. In this instance, I tend to include their defenses. Their offenses, I would also include here, except minions typically get their offenses kind of equalized, so +5 to hit, +5 damage if they're power level 5, just to keep things simple. And then after you're done with the scene, you write your wrap-up, which is, how does this scene resolve and where do we go from here? You write all of that for every scene that you want to include in the story until you get to the end, which can be 4 scenes, it can be 6 scenes, it can be 12 scenes. Depending on how big your time block is that you're trying to fill and the role of what the story is. After we get to the end of the adventure, I include an epilogue for most of mine, which is sort of wrap up for the whole adventure. What are some of the immediate consequences of what happened here? What are some of the potential long-term consequences? And what are some areas where I can weave in just a little bit of a continuation of the story if that's what the heroes decide they want to do? In this instance, in the epilogue, the heroes emerge from the U-boat and back to Freedom City, still under siege. They've stopped the influx of new troops, but there are legions still marching through the city. So this Shadow and U.S. military battle continues. But the heroes find out that they have a mysterious ally that they can use to time travel forward. Because this is a loop, they're going to be stuck in it. Gene Crone asks, do you make villains specific to hero archetype? Yes. Generally, when I'm looking at, if I need to modify a villain in a pre-written module, I'll look at who my player characters are and I'll say, do they have a nemesis that they particularly like to beat up on? Does it make sense for them to be here? Or is there a kind of villain I can introduce that is going to offer a challenge specific for my group? So if my heroes are all primarily technological, having a hero who nullifies technology, or having a villain who nullifies technology becomes a much more interesting challenge than a villain who nullifies magic. Looking at things like that. Then I go into rewards, which is generally what do the heroes get for accomplishing this? Do they get power points? Do they get connections to other people in the setting? Do they get favors? Does reputation increase? And how can I make that personal for them? In the instance we're talking about, I decided that we wanted to have Centuria Bowman and Johnny Rocket and Daedalus as our heroes. So one of the rewards is you can give them power points, and then they also get a little bit of story resolution. This can be, Centuria finally got to fight alongside her dad. You got to have a conversation with him. What does that look like? That's a reward in itself, especially if that's something Centuria's player is really invested in. It can be that Golden Age Bowman shows Modern Bowman a couple of trick arrows that Modern Bowman doesn't know how to make, and he can add those new arrows to his sheet using the power points he got from this adventure. It depends on the game system you're running, but looking at things like gold pieces, magic items, whatever is the correct reward, and whatever encourages the gameplay loop that you're trying to encourage. And then after that, I do continuing the adventure, which is just what happens next? Where are some places we can go? If it's part of an ongoing series, such as Chrono Crisis Part 1 Independence Day, I just made it simple. It leads directly into Part 2, Showdown at Magic Mesa, where the heroes must uncover more about Zeitgeist's benefactor, find and help the missing Dr. Tomorrow, stalked by enemies from the future while thwarting another would-be conqueror from the past. So just a little bit of an idea of what's going to happen next, what could be some possible consequences. If it's not part of an ongoing campaign, you might lean into something like, what are some potential future adventure hooks related to the consequences of the story. Hey, Learn Music, how are you doing today? And hey, Tempo, sorry you're late. We've been going through the idea of how to tailor a pre-written module to your needs, whether that's to your group, whether it's to your taste, whether it's to power level differences. I'm talking from a Mutants and Masterminds perspective, but a lot of what I'm talking about is applicable to whatever game system you're trying to run. And then the final thing, it's important to know the stat blocks for the major characters in the story. What does Golden Age Bowman get as an option? Golden Age Arrow. Then the bad guys, the Shadow Troopers here, Zeitgeist, Remlak the Rover, and some of them might get a big stat block in the back. Just all depends. But yeah, just to give a brief recap for the folks who are just tuning in, when you decide that you want to pick up an adventure module, and I'll stop sharing that. I'll keep it up for now. When you decide that you want to do a pre-written module, one of the things you start by asking yourself, what is this module for? Why am I, what is it about this module that I want, that I need to run it for? Is it something where we're trying to do something new and fresh compared to what we usually play? Is it something like I just need a break from writing adventures, and this is something I can pull off of the shelf and just throw you into? Is it, in this instance, this adventure takes place in the past, is it a time travel adventure, or is it an opportunity to do a flashback to deliver information to your players in a gamified way? If you want to pull the time travel bits out and slot in, this is actually a historical event, here's your characters for this scenario. Is it a demo of the game system because your group isn't sure that they want to run a campaign of this particular game? Or is it a one-shot just because the other GM needs a break? There's lots of different reasons you might grab a pre-written module. Then the second thing I delve into is how can I tailor this module to my characters? There are the obvious things like adjusting level. In Mutants Masterminds terms, this adventure is for power level 10. I talked a little bit about how to move it up to like power level 12 by increasing either the power level of the characters opposing the superheroes or changing the characters opposing the superheroes. So our Shadow Troopers, I talked about moving them from power level 5 to power level 7, either by giving them just better stats, maybe in the thousands of times they've attempted to do this particular story. The Shadow Troopers have gained super soldier powers. Zeitgeist has been experimenting on them, trying to make them bigger and badder to deal with Bowman and his resistance. Or maybe they're more powerful because they have interesting tricks that they can pull on the heroes. The Shadow Troopers, having gone through the time loop so many times, know what to expect, and to reflect that in game terms, we give them maybe a luck control power, where they can force a reroll on a hero, or they get some free instant counters on heroes because they know, hey, this is going to happen, so I'm going to move this truck in front of the way. Sort of ways that you can tailor it to make it more challenging or less challenging if you're dealing with less powerful heroes. We also talked about, what about their number? Gene Caron asks. Yeah, a lot of adventures tend to include a sort of equation when you're talking about how many villains show up. Things like the number of Shadow Troopers is equal to the amount of players times 4, or equal to the amount of players times 6. I find that with minions in particular, you have a lot of leeway to add more to challenge your heroes if you need to. That does depend on what kind of powers your heroes have. If they have a lot of area of effects, or if they have a lot of takedown advantage, minions are going to be a trivial addition to a scene. So you want to look at things like, do I add lieutenant characters? Are there low-level supervillains I can throw into the mix to change up the threat of this scene? Or if they don't have ways of clearing a lot of minions, adding that many characters for them to deal with automatically makes it more dangerous to them because they are dealing with typically what the villains deal with, the action economy being unbalanced, as 30 Shadow Troopers show up and try to beat up the heroes, and they can take out 3 a turn. Things like that. You want to check your combat encounters in particular, just to say, is this something that my heroes are going to struggle with? Is there anything I can do to make it a little easier or a little harder for them, depending on what this scene is for? There's also, in this example for Independence Day, I wanted to talk about using Centuria, Bowman, Johnny Rocket, and Daedalus as our power level 12 characters, and noting that Bowman, Centuria, and Johnny all have family members who are active superheroes in the Golden Age, this time period that we're in. And what does that do for us? What are some dramatic stakes that we can pull from that idea? Centuria never met her dad, so is there something cool that we can do with that? Bowman gets to work with his grandpa and his dad, so there's like a family tree of archers right there. All that fun stuff. And Daedalus was alive in this time period, so do we get a chance to have Daedalus run into himself or ask, what happened to me? Why am I not here? To really psych out his players. So sort of looking at all those fun things. Also taking a look at who the antagonist in the adventure is, and if there is a similar antagonist that the players already have a relationship with, can you pull out, like Zeitgeist is the main antagonist of this adventure, can you swap Zeitgeist out for another Shadow person like Superior or Ragnarok, or can you swap him out maybe for Taurus in the Labyrinth instead of Shadow? Little tweaks like that don't impact the flow of the story very much, but they add a connection for your player characters to zero in on. And then the other thing we talked about was how to expand the adventure if you're looking to run it for longer. I ran Nether War, which is 6 pre-written modules for 53 adventures. So I know all about running too much adventure out of a pre-written module. And finding ways to shorten it, and to finding ways. The last thing I really wanted to nail in, we talked about this a little bit, was that a pre-written module is intended to be a toolbox for you as the GM to use as you need. You know, do you need a whole adventure? Do you need basically a rough outline for an adventure, and you fill in the gaps here? You add extra scenes, you add connecting tissue, expand on concepts, you make things last longer. Or do you just need one scene out of an adventure? Like you see something really cool in the story and you're like, I want to do that. And you take that scene, you pull it out of this adventure wholesale, and you shove it into any other adventure that you're running. You take out the sort of specifics, the Shadow Troopers or whatever, and you are like, I like the idea of this time loop. What can I do with a time loop? And we have a sidebar all about the time loop, because I think it's the coolest part of the story. So, time loop option. Independence Day is a relatively straightforward adventure. If you want to complicate things and extend the adventure, you can have Zeitgeist carry out his threat. When the heroes defeat him, they suddenly find themselves back in scene 1 at the moment when they arrived in 1941, and events start playing out over again from the beginning. What Zeitgeist did not account for is that the heroes are protected by the time travel effect that brought them to 1941, so they also remember the prior iterations of the time loop. They not only have to go through the process of defeating Zeitgeist again, although more easily since they had the benefit of prior knowledge, they also have to prevent him from escaping into the time stream to reset the loop again. So this is a whole scene idea that you can pull out of this adventure and put into any other adventure. Tempo says, how about death whale assassins who are sarcas who shroud themselves in all black suits and veils while dehorning and mutilating themselves as penance due to committing kinslaying and kingslaying? It's intense, but I'm here for it. Yeah, and that's do you want this to take place in Freedom City during the Golden Age, or do you want to move this, is this a steampunk submarine and it's in Victorian London? Or do you want to take this idea, this bare bones concept of heroes thrown into a different time period, face off against an antagonist who knows that it's a time loop and deals with that consequence and their minions? The cool thing about pre-written modules is that they do a lot of the heavy lifting creatively for you. So, they could serve as a great springboard for ideas. Maybe in a darker era, perhaps. Yeah, and some groups, that's their jam. It's I've been accused of being the lighter tone GM many times. Yeah, so please feel free to write down your questions about how to deal with a pre-written module, whether in the chat now for the next couple minutes or in the comments of this video. I try to go back to previous episodes and answer comments as I have time. While I'm waiting for some questions to come in, I'll just let everybody know. Today is the day that we are doing our Mutants and Masterminds developer Q&A. So if you're watching this live, we'll be over on the Atomic Think Tank around 8 p.m. EST. And we should also have Thursdays this week on Thursday. And Eminem Monday will be back on Monday. If I'm not mistaken, we also have our... there's also the Eminem workshop on Friday. But lots of opportunities to engage with us here at Green Ronin over the next week or so. Yeah. Yeah. Tempo says this is related to Arc Knight spoilers, so try not to look them too much because story spoilers. Oh. As a forever GM, I love spoilers, but... Oh, the Deathvale Assassins, I mean. Okay, cool. Awesome. Well, everyone, thank you again for tuning in for another episode of The Joy of Game Mastering. What do we want to talk about our next episode? Are there any topics that are, eating away at anybody? Anything that people want to chat about? We'll be back here again in 2 weeks. So that will be... Math is hard, the 29th. Yes, we'll be back on Tuesday, October 29th at 5 p.m. EST. What are some topics that people want to hear about? I've got my list, but I really liked this conversation today about pre-written modules. I hope that you're able to find some use for you and your group. Whoops. Maybe how to keep things fresh at the table. Let me put that down as our topic. Keeping it fresh. Yeah, that can definitely be an interesting topic of conversation. It's easy to fall into a gameplay loop. So finding ways to keep that loop new and interesting, that will be our next topic. So thank you, everybody. Yes, the VOD should be up immediately after I press end stream, so please keep an eye out. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. I'm happy to dive in and look at them when I come back around. So until the next time, please remember that game mastering is not as scary as it looks to be, and you can find so much joy in it. It's very important, and it is not as difficult as it looks. You are amazing, and I will see you all next time. Bye.